New research shows an alarming number of Australians are 10 years old or younger when they have their first taste of alcohol, with parents mistakenly believing it's safe.
Jason, go and get your old man a beer, will you?
This is how most young Australians are introduced to alcohol, at home and by family. National guidelines recommend alcohol shouldn't be consumed until the late teens, but new Salvation Army research reveals a staggering 2.3 million Australians had their first sip aged 10 or younger.
There has been a culture of saying it's okay to give your children a drink at home in a safe environment, but the reality is it's not safe.
Kylie and Daniel first tried alcohol before they were 10. Both later became alcoholics.
It'd take me to places I didn't want to be, turned me into a person I didn't want to be.
They're urging parents to keep their children away from alcohol.
Try to hold them off as long as possible. Teach them it's a bad thing, not a good thing.
But the Salvo's research has found 6 million Australians still believe it's safe to give under 15s the occasional sip, despite medical evidence linking early drinking to later problems.
Don't allow your children to drink. It's crazy.
Anastasia Salamastrakis, 7 News.
Disturbing new research has found more than 2 million Australians are at risk of developing alcohol-related problems after taking their first sip before the age of 10. Vicky Jardim tells us the Salvation Army has launched a major campaign urging parents to say no to their children.
For recovering alcoholics Kylie and Daniel, coffee is now their drink of choice. They were given their first taste of alcohol before the age of 10. At the height of her addiction, Kylie lost her children and was drinking 2 casks of wine a day, even found herself in jail with no idea of how she got there.
Hell and back. That's how it's affected my life. It'd take me to places I didn't want to be.
Massive spiral. Not until I was late 20s before I even realised I needed help.
New research released by the Salvation Army paints a startling picture of Australia's drinking culture. It found 2.3 million Australians had their first drink before the age of 10. By the age of 14, that figure almost triples.
The sips become, in too many cases, a regular introduction to alcohol, and if it is even in small quantities, certainly doctors are warning against that.
The research also found 7 out of 10 Australians are not aware of the national guidelines on safe drinking levels. Those that have been gripped by alcoholism say even a small amount can lead to problems later in life.
Introducing it to them as well, I feel, is just pushing it down their throats.
Try to hold them off as long as possible. Teach them it's a bad thing, not a good thing.
Vicky Jardim, 9 News.
Grog shock. Alarming figures reveal Aussies are downing their first drinks at the age of 10.
So I was down to 2 casks of wine a day. I couldn't get out of bed without having a drink.
A dire warning for parents tonight to keep their teenagers away from alcohol for as long as possible. More than 2 million Australians could be at risk of alcohol-related problems after having their first drink before they were 10.
It's behaviour like this, the Salvos say, often stems back to early childhood.
There has been a culture of saying it's okay to give your children a drink at home in a safe environment, but the reality is it's not safe.
It's a tough line, putting the welfare group at odds with many parents. A survey of 700 people found 30% had tasted alcohol before 14 years of age, 13% before they were 10.
Losing friendships, losing relationships, losing jobs.
Daniel's spiral into alcoholism started when he was just 8. Kylie was 13 when she began binging, eventually drinking 2 casks of wine a day. Both agree no level of alcohol is safe for children.
I think there's plenty of time down the road for kids to experience that when they're old enough to make that decision themselves.
Each year more than 3,000 Australians die as a direct result of excessive drinking, and another 70,000 end up in hospital. All that leaves taxpayers with an annual bill topping $7.5 billion.
Do you reckon I can have a drink too?
Despite a government ad campaign and new guidelines advising parents to wait until their teens are at least 15 before taking a tipple, for many parents, it's easier said than done.
I think it's extremely difficult, particularly when they see us drinking a glass of wine with dinner. So yeah, it's hard to say one thing and do another.
Well, it's better than kids drinking with unresponsible teenagers.
Yeah, like in the city and stuff by themselves.
Gerard Cholton, 10 News.
It's claimed millions of Australians have put themselves at risk of developing alcohol problems later in life by drinking before the age of 10. Research commissioned by the Salvation Army shows more than 2 million Australians were under 10 years old when they first tried alcohol.
Alcohol kills one Australian teenager every week and puts another 60 into critical care in hospital. It takes courage and good luck to talk about it.
The first time I was drunk, I was 14 years old.
Many are even younger than that when they begin drinking.
The first time I got drunk was when I was 12.
The nationwide survey by the Salvation Army has revealed a shocking problem far more widespread than imagined. Almost 2.5 million Australians began drinking when they were just 10 or even younger. By the age of 14, 6 million have had their first drink, all too often with the knowledge and acquiescence of their parents, despite the recent spate of television commercials warning of the danger.
Kids and alcohol don't mix.
And proposals to raise the legal drinking age from 18 get little support.
A lot of families don't even support that, so they want their children to start drinking from 14 or so.
And they do.
It was about 13, 14,
12.
I think my dad said it was okay to drink wine from about 14.
It just takes us a long time to realise the seriousness of what we're actually dealing with.
The Salvation Army says a real step in the right direction would be a tobacco-style ban on alcohol advertising. Equally, it says that's unlikely for a long time to come. Peter Harvey, 9 News.
Millions of Australians are said to be putting themselves at risk of developing drinking problems later in life. Research commissioned by the Salvation Army shows that more than 2 million Australians were under the age of 10 when they first tried alcohol. National guidelines urge teenagers to delay drinking as long as possible to cut down on the chances of developing alcohol problems.
More than 2 million Australians tried their first drink before they turned 10, according to a new study. The research, commissioned by the Salvation Army, shows that millions of Australians are at risk of developing problems with alcohol later in life by drinking while very young. The Salvos say the critical message that children and teenagers shouldn't drink is not getting through.
Many of us, however, have the notion that if they introduce alcohol to children young in a safe and controlled environment, their child or teenager will learn how to drink safely, thereby avoiding problems later in life. But the evidence is in on this one.
The study says that nearly 9 million Australians had the first taste of alcohol with family.
2 million Australians have admitted to having their first taste of alcohol when they were less than 10 years old. The Salvation Army has released these statistics, saying that drinking culture is damaging many, like recovering alcoholic Danielle, who had her first sip of a shandy when she was just 7.
I do believe that having that first drink at such a young age, I had the taste for it, and it was kind of instilled.
One Australian teenager dies every week in an alcohol-related incident.
Plus Booze Nation. Millions of Australians drinking before the age of 10.
And within a couple of months I was down to 2 casks of wine a day.
Parents are being warned to keep their teenagers away from alcohol for as long as possible. Alarming new figures reveal 2 million Australians have downed their first drinks by the age of 10.
Generation Y's binge drinking is out of control and it's being blamed on parents.
There has been a culture of saying it's okay to give your children a drink at home in a safe environment, but the reality is it's not safe.
A survey of 700 people found 30% had tasted alcohol before 14 years of age, 13% before they were 10.
Losing friendships, losing relationships, losing jobs.
Daniel's spiral into alcoholism started when he was just 8. Kylie was 13 when she began binging, eventually drinking 2 casks of wine a day.
It certainly does hurt, and I think there's plenty of time down the road for kids to experience that when they're old enough to make that decision themselves.
A new survey shows around half the Australian population is not aware of new national guidelines on alcohol consumption. The guidelines suggest it's best for parents to delay exposing their children to alcohol in their early teenage years. A new survey shows around half the Australian population is not aware of new national guidelines on alcohol consumption. The guidelines suggest it's best for parents to delay exposing their children to alcohol in their early teenage years.
Yes, the research also shows more than 2 million Australians had their first alcoholic drink when they were 10 years of age or younger. And for more on this, we're joined by Major Brad Halsey from the Salvation Army, who is in our Melbourne studios this morning. Major Halsey, thanks very much for your time. Your research shows that parents just aren't aware of the alcohol consumption guidelines. What do you think the government should do to increase the awareness?
It is a concern because these guidelines are excellent guidelines. In actual fact, it was something like 69% of those we surveyed were not aware of those guidelines, and that's a high number. We hope that certainly the federal government, supported by state governments, can facilitate ongoing promotional campaigns about those, just simply letting people know where to find them on the web and perhaps publishing them regularly, because they're worth knowing and being aware of the content of them.
I've seen at least one commercial on television in recent weeks, parents talking about whether they should give their teenager a drink or not. Does that campaign seem to be working?
It's a good campaign. It's undertaken by an organisation known as Drinkwise, which is co-funded by the federal government and indeed the alcohol industry. So there's been some debate about that, but the messages of the campaign are good. Think long and hard about when you introduce alcohol to your children, because the increasing medical evidence both nationally in Australia and internationally is urging as late a possible introduction to the use of alcohol as is possible.
Yes, your research suggests that exposing young people to alcohol at an early age does actually more harm than good, whereas some parents have thought that maybe introducing it in the home setting is a good way to approach it.
Absolutely, and we're certainly mindful of the challenges of parenting and how to bring up children. It's a huge task, and we're not trying to take potshots here at Australian Parents. The wisdom thus far has been, if you're going to be a drinking family, as it were, to perhaps introduce alcohol at an earlier age. But increasingly, the medical evidence is this is not a good practice. It impacts upon children and teenagers, and as you said in your introduction, something like 2.3 million Australians had their first taste of alcohol before they were 10, another 3.5 million before they were 14, even 14 years of age. It's a very young age for people to be consuming alcohol.
But Major, aren't there advantages to teaching children at home that alcohol is there to be enjoyed and not to be drinking excessively, like have a couple of glasses of wine or a glass of wine with a meal is quite acceptable and probably not unhealthy?
Well, that has been the view thus far, and indeed the previous national guidelines gave something like that as a recommendation. However, there is increasing medical evidence that because our brains don't mature fully until very late teens, that the impact of even a small amount of alcohol on a young person, be they pre-teen or in their teens, can be and is significantly more than what the impact of alcohol is for adults. So that leads into some really unfortunate behaviours in too many cases in relation to young people.
Yeah, the smoking campaign that's currently on television, my 5-year-old has to cover her eyes when that comes on with its graphic images. Do you think we actually need to strike the education back to the children because maybe it's not going to work with the parents?
Yes, it's difficult to know with this subject as to whether or not the marketing should be directed at children. Certainly teenagers, we think, are becoming increasingly aware. Not that it necessarily changes behaviours. It's a difficult thing. There's a lot of peer group pressure amongst the teen world in terms of all sorts of behaviours, including alcohol. But whether or not marketing campaigns are refined and do target younger people, that may be the case. But at this stage, we're certainly urging adults, parents to think about these things, to talk about it with each other, to talk about it with their children.
And there are also concerns, I see, that people who drink alcohol before the age of 14 are more likely to develop a dependency than someone who took it up, say, after 21 years of age.
Yes, it's certainly becoming a recurrent theme in this area of research, particularly focusing on people, sadly, who become addicted in their adult years, and the overwhelming evidence is that they started drinking young. Now, we're not trying to alarm parents or create nightmare scenarios, but the facts are that for those who form very serious and very significant alcohol disorders in their adult years, they were introduced or commenced drinking themselves at a young age. So that's another reason to just delay it as far as possible. The vast majority, if not all parents, want the very best for their children, and this is one of those areas that we think people need to think about a lot.
Major Halsey, thank you for your time and good luck with the campaign.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Can you remember when you had your first sip of alcohol? Well, at least 2 million Australians say they had their first taste when they were less than 10 years old. Launching a new alcohol awareness campaign, research by the Salvation Army shows one teenager a week dies from an alcohol-related incident. We're joined now live by Major Paul Kinder from the Salvation Army. 10 is quite a young age to start having alcohol. Do you believe that has a flow-on effect later in life?
It's disturbing, really, because research indicates that although people think that introducing young people to alcohol at an early age and in a supervised environment is okay, research indicates that it is not okay. That, in fact, the earlier onset of alcohol use delays the sedative effect of drinking, and so teenagers, young people, just keep on drinking and don't know when to stop.
But even a sip in the family home?
Even a sip in the family home introduces the alcohol to the brain, and the brain is still developing. And these important sedative impacts, these important boundaries are not yet registering in young brains. And so the development is delayed.
Because there's some conflicting messages out there, aren't there? I mean, an international study released last week found that it wasn't so bad. So how do you counter the misinformation or the different information?
The information that we're drawing on is from research at Deakin University, at Boston University, and even with the National Medical Research Foundation, which indicates that young brains are still developing an early use of alcohol. The national guidelines on alcohol use recommend that the longer that we can delay the introduction of alcohol to young people, be well beyond 15, 17 years, the better it is for them, the more likely they are to be able to resist the onset of alcohol problems later in life.
I imagine parents who are offering it at home believe they are preventing the forbidden fruit syndrome. I mean, what is better advice, do you think? How can you help parents try to manage this problem?
The best option is to talk, to become aware of the national guidelines. It was staggering that in this same research, nearly 90% of Australians were unaware of the national guidelines on alcohol in young people. So become aware of the national guidelines, talk with your young people, educate them, set boundaries. Don't use scare tactics, but set boundaries, and by all means, set an example yourself.
OK, well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Good luck with the campaign.
Thank you, Kelly.
Shocking statistics out this morning show that almost 2.5 million Australians had their first taste of alcohol when they were just 10 years old. For more, I'm joined this morning by Major Gary Masters from the Salvation Army. Good morning, Major. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Those statistics are just frightening. How does anyone get access to alcohol at just 10?
Well, it really is quite an incredible statistic, and we're very disturbed by those sorts of numbers. I think it really comes back to parents and they need to be more diligent in some of their practices with regard to alcohol, leaving alcohol around, leaving glasses available that children can finish the dregs, or other activities like that, leaving it in the fridge where it's unsupervised. A whole lot of ways that children can access alcohol, and they will if they're given the opportunity.
And the research is quite adamant on the fact that if you're drinking alcohol at that age, the damage is substantial and also leads to problems later in life.
It does. We have looked at these statistics, and we're seeing that 2.3 million children under the age of 10 have tasted alcohol. It rises to 6 million by the age of 14, and it then rises to 12.3 million by the age of 18. This in a country where the legal drinking age is 18, and yet that many Australians have tried alcohol by the age of 18.
So does your research show that they're accessing that alcohol by themselves as teenagers or as 10-year-olds, or that's being given to them by their parents?
In the majority of cases, it's actually being given supervised in the home or at a restaurant when people are out. People have this misconception that by introducing their children to alcohol at an early age, they're going to be helping them to redress any alcohol or potential alcohol problems later in life. The new research is showing this is simply not the case. Children who are introduced to alcohol at an early age are doing irreparable damage to growing bodies and developing minds, and we really need to be far more vigilant about alcohol and its impact upon our children.
So do we need to re-educate parents? How do we stop teenagers doing this damage, or even 10-year-olds doing this extraordinary damage to themselves?
I think therein is the critical question, and the Salvation Army has some very, very good suggestions about how they can be accessed and what sort of measures can be put in place. If people are interested, they can go to our website at salvationarmy.org.au and download some information sheets, and also find a link there to the National Alcohol Awareness site that has very good information about how parents can address some of these issues.
Major problem. Thanks for joining us this morning,
Thank
Major
you.
Gary Masters.
Disturbing revelations about the scale of underage drinking in Australia. Disturbing new research has revealed more than 2 million Australians had their first alcoholic drink when they were just 10 years old or younger. The Salvation Army study also shows millions of parents mistakenly believe a sip of alcohol won't harm their children. For more on this, we're joined by Major Brad House from the Salvation Army. Good afternoon, Major. Were you surprised by this research?
Yes, we were surprised. We know that it's a common practice in the community to share a sip of alcohol with children, but when it came back, the sort of numbers, as you say, more than 2 million people said they had their first sip before they were 10 years of age, and another 3.5 million people had been introduced to alcohol by the time they were 14. To us, they're quite startling and disturbing numbers.
Major, many parents believe that it's safer if they supervise their children's drinking at home. Why isn't this the case?
I think the first thing we want to say is we're certainly not intending to be critical of parents. It's a very demanding role to bring up children, and we all know how busy people can be. But perhaps it's misinformation. Increasingly, medical research is showing that because our brains literally don't mature until late teens, any sip of alcohol at a young age has a disproportionate impact and can be quite serious. It can also set in train patterns of social drinking and other that go long into adult life.
Major, what needs to be done here?
We're hoping as a result of this campaign that people will think, they'll talk and they'll debate this issue amongst themselves, that parents will certainly look at some of the latest research and explore that. But we're also very keen for all levels of government to further promote the National Health and Medical Research Council's guidelines issued this earlier, which warn parents against giving any alcohol to children under 15 and to delay alcohol for 15 to 17-year-olds as long as possible. They're good guidelines, but many people are unaware of them.
OK, Major Brad House, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Today on 9am, drinking before 10. The latest research has found that more than 2 million Australians have taken their first slug of booze by the age of 10. Too young to realise that the earlier they start, the more likely they'll become a problem drinker with a serious dependency. This morning we'll find out why the message isn't getting heard. An innocent drink at home with mum and dad seems like a sensible introduction to alcohol, but should it take place before the age of 14, your child is more likely to become an alcoholic than the child that waits until he's 21. According to the Salvos, 2.3 million Australians had their first drink at the age of 10 or under.
This morning we're joined by Catherine Wright, who coordinates drug and alcohol rehab programs for the Salvos, and Daniel McRae, who took his first sip of alcohol when he was only 8. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Catherine, maybe we could start with you. Why did the Salvos think it was necessary to do a survey into alcohol use in Australia?
Look, we do a yearly survey on alcohol use, but the reason we chose this topic this year was because we had noticed the concerning trends in our rehabilitation programs where people coming in we always ask how old they were when they had their first drink, and they'd commonly say 8, 10. One woman told me she was 4 years old when she remembers first getting drunk. So, you know, we wondered whether this was a widespread problem.
But before you said that, I was just about to say, what is considered a first drink? Is that a sip of mum and dad's wine at the table? Is it a glass of wine?
Yeah, I think it varies from family to family, but what the research shows is that the longer you can delay the first experience of alcohol, whatever that might be, the less likely a child is to have problems later in life, and also the more likely they are to avoid problems on the developing brain, which is very vulnerable to alcohol.
Daniel, when did you first start drinking?
8.
8?
Yep.
And was it regular then?
No. No, I started off with a sip, more maybe at family dues, something like that.
Yeah.
Out with, family, I'd say. But
right. Yeah. So, and you weren't hiding this? It was in the open?
It's out in the open, yeah.
When do you remember it progressing beyond just a sip here or there?
Maybe late primary school with friends.
With friends?
Where
So you weren't the only kid who was doing it?
Oh, no, no.
Where would you drink, and what would you drink, and how would you get it?
Maybe going into the parents' alcohol cupboard, making rocket fuel, that sort of stuff.
Just mixing something and...
getting stupidly drunk, throwing up, falling over.
At what age were you getting stupidly drunk and falling over?
12.
Gee whiz. And so did you discover that you developed a kind of dependency on alcohol?
By the age of about 16, I realised I was, wagging school.